My name is Layla Morgan. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the person people describe as steady. Not loud, not dramatic, just dependable. I live in Manchester, England. I work in operations for a mid-sized logistics company, one of those invisible roles that keep everything moving but rarely gets mentioned in meetings unless something goes wrong. I'm not the kind of woman who commands a room with volume. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for attention. I listen. I document. I remember. Most people assume that means I'm soft. They see a calm face and think I won't push back. They hear a measured tone and think I won't fight. They mistake composure for compliance. And for a long time, I let them. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic showdowns or explosive confrontations. There were no slammed doors, no viral speeches, no public humiliation. It's about something quieter. It's about what happens when you're told gently, repeatedly, that your time is flexible, that your boundaries are negotiable, that your weekends aren't really yours. It's about how slowly just this once becomes every week, and how being reliable can quietly turn into being used. They forced me to work weekends. At first, it sounded temporary, necessary, team spirit. We all have to pull together. I understood pressure. I understood deadlines. I understood loyalty. What they didn't understand was that I was keeping track. Every Saturday, every Sunday, every late night login, every unpaid hour was framed as dedication instead of labor. I didn't argue at the moment. I didn't threaten. I didn't demand. I tracked. This is the story of how silence became strategy, how invisibility became leverage, how patience, real patience, can be mistaken for weakness until the numbers start speaking for you. Because in the end, I didn't need to shout. The labor board did the math for them. And when they did, the room went very quiet. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever given more than you were paid for, hoping someone would eventually notice? To them, I was the safe one, not the ambitious one, not the difficult one, not the one who would demand recognition or negotiate aggressively. I was the one who said, "That's fine." When extra tasks landed on my desk at 4:52 p.m. on a Friday, I was the one who stayed behind to fix the spreadsheet nobody else wanted to touch. In operations, visibility only comes when something breaks. If the deliveries go out on time, no one asks how. If the schedules align, no one wonders who aligned them. That was my territory, quiet alignment. My manager, Paul, used to introduce me to new hires as our backbone. He'd say it with a smile, like it was praise. And it was, in a way. But I learned something important about being called the backbone. Backbones aren't supposed to complain. They're supposed to carry weight. In meetings, I didn't dominate conversations. I took notes. I clarified timelines. I followed up on loose threads. When someone forgot to send a confirmation email, I sent it. When a client escalated a complaint, I de-escalated it. It made everyone's life easier, which made me convenient. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like trust. People hand you things because they know you won't drop them. They rely on you because you've proven yourself reliable. But slowly, reliability turns into an assumption. I started noticing small patterns. If a project needed extra attention, it landed with me. If someone needed to swap shifts temporarily, I was the first suggestion. When quarterly reports ran long, and someone had to stay late, it was understood that I would. Not because I was the most junior. Not because I was the only capable one. I wasn't. But because I didn't resist. Or at least, I didn't visibly resist. They saw composure and translated it as capacity. There's a difference. Capacity is how much you can handle. Composure is how little you show. By the end of my second year, I had unofficially become the person who absorbed overflow. The team even joked about it. "Just give it to Layla. She'll sort it." They meant it as a compliment. I know they did. But something subtle happens when your name becomes the solution to everyone else's inconvenience. You stop being a colleague. You become a buffer. And buffers don't get overtime. Buffers don't get bonuses for stepping up. Buffers are just there. I remember one specific Friday evening. The office was thinning out. Chairs rolling back, laptops snapping shut, Paul stood by my desk and said, casually, "We might need some coverage this weekend. Nothing crazy, just to monitor shipments." He didn't ask. He said but he was looking at me. I smiled. Of course I did. That small, polite, neutral smile that says I'm agreeable but not thrilled. "Okay," I replied. It was such a small word, but it built a pattern. To them, I was stable, adaptable, always available. They didn't see the cost of that availability. They didn't see the recalculated dinner plans, the postponed rest, the quiet resentment that I folded carefully and tucked away. Because I didn't show it. And when you don't show something, people assume it isn't there. That was who I was to them. Useful, calm, replaceable. A weekend here, a late night there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth questioning. The first time it happened, it didn't feel like a violation. It felt like teamwork. That Saturday morning, I woke up at 6:45 out of habit. My flat was quiet, washed in that pale Manchester light that makes everything look softer than it is. I made coffee, opened my laptop at the kitchen table, and logged into the system. Just monitoring, Paul had said. Monitoring turned into coordinating. Coordinating turned into calling a warehouse supervisor who hadn't shown up. That turned into reassigning drivers and rerouting 2 shipments that had been misscanned the night before. By 11:30 a.m., I was deep in it. My phone buzzed, a message from Paul. "Thanks for jumping on this. You're a lifesaver." It was friendly, appreciative, harmless. I stared at the message longer than necessary. There's something subtle about gratitude when it replaces compensation. It feels warm in the moment. It costs nothing to give, and it makes you hesitate to ask for more. I didn't think about pay that day. I thought about being competent, about solving the issue before Monday, so the week would start smoothly. When Monday came, no one mentioned Saturday in the team meeting. We reviewed shipment metrics. We discussed delays. Paul congratulated the team for pulling together. I waited not for applause, but for acknowledgement of the hours. There was none. After the meeting, I approached Paul casually. "Just to clarify," I said lightly, "how should I log Saturday's hours?" He blinked, not annoyed, just surprised. "Oh," he said. "Right. Well, technically, we didn't pre-approve overtime for that. It was more of a voluntary check-in, wasn't it?" Voluntary? The word landed gently, like a hand on your shoulder guiding you backward. I was coordinating reroutes. I replied carefully. It wasn't just checking in. He nodded quickly, already half turned toward another conversation. I know. And we appreciate it. But if we log every extra hour, finance will have a fit. Let's call it team spirit this time. I'll make sure it's remembered. Remembered. Not paid, remembered. I smiled again. That same composed smile. Okay, there it was again. That small word. Back at my desk, I opened a blank document. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just practical. Saturday, 6:58 a.m. to 12:14 p.m. Tasks, warehouse staffing coordination, shipment reroutes, client escalation. I saved it. I told myself it was just for clarity, for my own records. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even certain it mattered. But something in me didn't like the softness of the word voluntary. The next weekend, there was another small situation. A delayed customs clearance, a missed handoff, a system glitch. "Can you just keep an eye on it?" Paul asked, almost apologetically. And I did. No overtime form, no official request. Just a message of thanks afterward. That was the first small cut. Not the hours themselves, but the normalization of them. No one raised an eyebrow. No one asked why I was online on a Sunday afternoon. In fact, when a colleague messaged me, she said, "Oh, good, you're around," as if being around was simply part of who I was. I didn't protest. I didn't escalate. I opened my black leather notebook that night and wrote the date. The start time, the end time, still calm, still composed, but now paying attention. It's strange how quickly something unusual becomes ordinary. By the third weekend, no one even framed it as a favor anymore. There was no, "Would you mind?" No, "Are you available?" It shifted into language that assumed compliance. "Layla, can you cover Saturday morning? We'll need eyes on the dashboard Sunday. Just loop in if anything escalates. The word just did a lot of work. Just check. Just monitor. Just respond if needed. But just rarely meant minimal effort. It meant staying within reach of my laptop all weekend. It meant structuring my personal life around potential disruptions. It meant never fully disconnecting. The first few times, I rationalized it. It's a busy quarter. We're short-staffed. This will stabilize soon. And maybe part of me believed that reliability was an investment, that consistency would eventually translate into recognition, into promotion, in respect. But respect that depends on overextension isn't respect. It's a dependency. I started noticing how easily my availability was woven into planning. On Fridays, while others discussed dinner reservations or football matches, someone would glance toward me and say, "We're covered this weekend, right?" Covered, as if I were infrastructure. Once, during a Monday debrief, Paul reviewed the weekend metrics and said, "Good catch on that routing error. Could have been messy." He didn't look at me when he said it. The room nodded, appreciative of the smooth outcome. I felt something subtle shift inside my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. Recognition without accountability. They benefited from the work. They acknowledged the results, but the cost remained invisible. I began testing small boundaries. One Friday, I replied, "I'll be offline Saturday afternoon." There was a pause in the group chat. "Oh," someone typed, "Is everything okay?" As if my unavailability required explanation. Yes, I wrote back, "Personal time." No emojis followed, no warmth, just silence. The next message redirected tasks around me temporarily. But by Sunday evening, my phone buzzed anyway. Quick question. Paul wrote, I stared at the notification longer than necessary. It wasn't urgent. It could have waited. But I answered, because that's what I had trained them to expect. That's the uncomfortable truth about normalization. It isn't something that happens to you. It happens with your participation. Every calm okay, every quick response, every weekend login. I wasn't being forced with threats. I was being guided with assumption. And assumptions are harder to fight because they don't look hostile. They look reasonable. At some point, one of my colleagues joked during lunch. Layla basically lives on the dashboard. Everyone laughed, including me. Humor is a powerful anesthetic. It turns imbalance into personality. I went home that evening and opened my notebook again. The pages were filling up. Dates stacked neatly. Hours calculated precisely. No dramatic annotations. Just facts. I began to notice the accumulation. 4 hours here, 6 hours there. An entire Sunday lost to system maintenance. Another Saturday spent coordinating cross-border documentation. When I added it together for the first time, the number surprised even me. Not because it was shocking, but because it was measurable. And measurement changes things. Up until then, the situation lived in feelings. Mild frustration, subtle fatigue, a quiet sense of being overlooked. But numbers don't care about interpretation. They simply exist. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself it's temporary. It's manageable. It's not worth the conflict. And maybe that was true at first. But normalization is patient. It doesn't escalate loudly. It settles in. And once something becomes normal, challenging it makes you look unreasonable. I understood that. Which is why I didn't challenge it. Not yet. There's a moment when you realize you're no longer being asked. You're being expected. It happened on a Thursday afternoon during quarterly planning. The conference room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and whiteboard markers. We were mapping out peak season coverage holidays, staffing gaps, contingency plans. Paul was writing names into boxes on the projected calendar. Jake's off mid-December. Priya's got leave approved for early January. We'll need someone stable across weekends. He didn't hesitate. He typed my name. Not as a suggestion, as infrastructure. I watched it appear on the screen. Layla, weekend oversight recurring. There's recurring. That word did something the others hadn't. Up until then, weekend work had been framed as temporary. A busy spell, a rough quarter, a few intense weeks. But this wasn't temporary. This was design. I didn't speak immediately. No one else did either. It felt settled, logical, efficient. Of course, Layla would handle it. She always does. That was the role I had been assigned. Reliable, calm under pressure, flexible, low maintenance. And invisible, not invisible in a cruel way. Invisible in a functional way. Like Wi-Fi. No one applauds it for working. They only notice if it fails. I went back to my desk afterward and opened the shared planning sheet privately. There it was again, my name threaded through Saturdays and Sundays for the next 3 months. No overtime column, no compensation discussion, just placement. I sat very still. Not because I was shocked, because I was recognizing something I had slowly built without meaning to. Roles aren't always assigned by managers. Sometimes they're shaped by patterns. I had become the woman who absorbs inconvenience, the woman who doesn't make scheduling complicated, the woman who understands business needs. There's a subtle praise that traps you. You're so easy to work with. You never make things difficult. We can always count on you. Each sentence sounds kind, but underneath, it reinforces the same expectation you will bend. That afternoon, a colleague leaned against my desk and said, half laughing, "Guess your weekends are officially gone." It was meant playfully. I smiled because that's what I did. "Looks like it," I replied, but something inside me had stopped smiling. I went home and sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open. I flipped back through the pages. The handwriting was neat, controlled, almost detached. Date, start time, end time, tasks. I turned to a fresh page and wrote a new heading. Projected weekend coverage, Q4. Then I began calculating what those recurring hours would look like over 3 months. Not emotionally. Mathematically, that was the shift. Up until that point, I had been reacting. Now, I was observing the structure. They hadn't shouted. They hadn't threatened. They hadn't demanded unpaid labor aggressively. They had simply assumed my compliance into permanence. And the most uncomfortable realization, they weren't entirely wrong to assume it, because I had never corrected it. I closed the notebook and placed it beside my laptop. For the first time, I didn't feel resentful. I felt clear. Clarity is different from anger. Anger is loud and urgent. Clarity is quiet and patient. And patience, when paired with documentation, becomes something else entirely. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in complete silence. I was sitting at my kitchen table again, laptop open, system dashboard glowing in that familiar, sterile blue. Outside, the city felt distant, a couple walking their dog. Someone is laughing from a nearby balcony. Normal weekend sounds. My phone buzzed with a message from a friend. "Brunch next Sunday." "You're not working again, are you?" I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Not because I didn't know the answer, because I was tired of the answer. I typed back, "I'll let you know." That phrase had become automatic, non-committal, flexible, adjustable to the needs of a company that didn't officially acknowledge those needs existed. A shipment alert flashed on my dashboard. Minor delay. Resolved within minutes. Technically, nothing required my presence. And that was when it hit me. I wasn't there because I was needed in that exact moment. I was there because they were comfortable knowing I would be. That distinction changed everything. Comfort is powerful. When someone grows comfortable with your sacrifice, they stop recognizing it as a sacrifice. I closed the laptop, not dramatically, just deliberately. The alert would resolve itself. The system had redundancy. There were automated fail-safes. I had built some of them. For the first time in months, I let the dashboard exist without me hovering over it. I sat back in my chair and allowed a question I had been avoiding to surface. If I stopped volunteering silently, what would actually happen? Would the company collapse? Would the team fall apart? Or would someone simply have to acknowledge that coverage requires compensation? I opened my notebook. The pages were no longer just records. They were evidence of a pattern. I flipped to the first entry, the voluntary Saturday. Then the next, and the next. I calculated the total again, slower this time, including projected Q4 weekends. The number was no longer abstract. It was significant, not life-changing on its own, but substantial enough that if it had been processed properly, it would have required approval, budget, formal recognition, which meant something important. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a cost-saving habit, and I was the cost. That realization didn't make me furious. It made me still. There's a kind of power in understanding the structure you're standing inside. I thought about my childhood for a moment, how conflict in my house used to escalate quickly. How I learned early that being useful kept the peace. That absorbing tension made me safe. Some habits follow you into adulthood dressed as professionalism. Be adaptable. Be agreeable. Don't be the difficult one. But adulthood gives you something childhood doesn't. Choice. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't threatened. I wasn't being coerced in a dramatic way. I was being relied upon in a way that benefited everyone except me, and I had participated. That Sunday, I didn't send a message. I didn't confront Paul. I didn't announce boundaries. I did something quieter. I researched employment law, overtime regulations, working time directives in the UK, policies around required availability versus voluntary check-ins. Not obsessively, calmly. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for clarity about where responsibility actually lived. The more I read, the more a subtle calm settled in my chest. There were rules, clear ones, and the pattern I had documented didn't align neatly with them. I closed my laptop again, this time not because I was withdrawing, but because I had begun something. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else. On Monday, I would show up the same way, calm, competent, measured, but internally, something had realigned. Silence was no longer compliance. It was an assessment. An assessment, when paired with patience, can become a strategy. On Monday morning, nothing looked different. I arrived at the office at 8:27 a.m. 3 minutes before my usual time. I made tea. I opened the shipment dashboard. I responded to overnight emails with the same measured tone I'd always used. If anyone had studied my face, they wouldn't have seen a shift. But silence feels different when it's chosen. Paul stopped by my desk mid-morning. "Thanks again for the weekend," he said casually. "Good catch on that customs flag." I nodded. It resolved quickly, and I left it there. No mention of hours, no visible frustration, no demand, because I wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. There's a difference between reacting and positioning. For months, my silence had been reactive, avoid conflict, keep peace, maintain stability. Now it was deliberate. I began responding differently in small, almost invisible ways. When someone said, "Can you just monitor this Saturday?" I replied, "Please send that in an email so I can review coverage requirements." The word review slowed things down. It introduced formality where there had only been an assumption. When Paul casually mentioned weekend planning in conversation, I asked evenly, "Should we formalize weekend oversight in writing so expectations are clear?" He hesitated, just slightly. "Let's not overcomplicate it," he said with a half smile. "We're flexible here." Flexible, that word again. Flexible for whom? I didn't challenge him. I simply nodded. But I stopped answering messages instantly on weekends. I gave them space. 10 minutes, sometimes 30, nothing collapsed. In fact, I noticed something interesting. Other team members began responding occasionally when I didn't. The world didn't tilt off its axis. It adjusted. That adjustment told me something important: the system had capacity. It had just been leaning on the easiest option, me. One Thursday afternoon, I overheard 2 colleagues discussing coverage. "Well, Layla's usually on," one of them said. "Yeah. But maybe we should rotate it," the other replied. "Feels like she's always stuck with it." I kept typing, expression neutral. They were beginning to see it. Not because I complained, but because I stopped cushioning the imbalance so completely. Silence, when it's strategic, reveals patterns to other people. If you constantly absorb pressure, no one feels it. If you step back slightly, the weight redistributes and suddenly it's noticeable. I continued documenting everything, but now I added detail. Who requested the coverage, whether it was framed as optional or required, whether there was a written acknowledgement. I also saved messages, screenshots, calendar invites, not obsessively, systematically. And I noticed something else. The language in written communication often contradicts the casual tone in conversation. In person, just if you're around. In email, we'll need you to oversee this weekend's operations. Need. That word carries obligation. An obligation changes the classification of hours. I wasn't angry as I collected this information. I was patient. Because I understood something clearly now. Confrontation without leverage is noise. Confrontation with documentation is gravity. One evening, as I closed my notebook, I realized I no longer felt resentful of logging the hours. I felt focused. They still saw the same Layla. Calm, cooperative, reliable. They mistook my composure for surrender. But composure is most powerful when it's intentional. And I had begun choosing it, not to endure, but to prepare. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. I didn't hire a lawyer immediately. I didn't file a complaint impulsively. I didn't even change my tone at work. What I did was learn. every evening for 2 weeks. I read through the UK working time regulations, government guidance pages, advisory articles from employment solicitors, case summaries from labor disputes involving unpaid overtime and voluntary weekend coverage. The language was precise. If work is required, directed, or reasonably expected, it counts. If availability is mandated, it counts. If refusal carries a negative consequence, it counts. I paid special attention to one phrase, implied obligation. You don't always have to be explicitly ordered. Sometimes expectation, reinforced through pattern and authority, becomes obligation. That phrase stayed with me. At work, nothing appeared different. Paul still joked about peak season. Colleagues still leaned on my desk for quick clarifications. I still resolved shipment escalations with the same measured tone. But behind the calm surface, I was mapping structure. I created a spreadsheet separate from my notebook. Dates, hours, message references, screenshots cross-indexed. I calculated the total unpaid weekend hours over 6 months. Then I projected forward based on the recurring Q4 schedule. The number became undeniable. Not exaggerated, not inflated, simply factual. I also reviewed my employment contract, carefully, line by line. Standard working hours Monday to Friday. Overtime requires prior approval. Additional hours compensated through pay or time off in lieu. There was no clause assigning permanent weekend oversight without compensation. None. That mattered. I didn't interpret it emotionally. I interpreted it structurally. At the office, small shifts continued. When weekend coverage was mentioned verbally, I followed up with an email just confirming expectations for Saturday coverage. Please clarify whether this is mandatory and how hours should be logged. That sentence did something subtle. It forced clarity. Sometimes the reply came vague. Let's stay flexible. Other times it came directly. Yes, we'll need you to oversee. I archived both, because ambiguity and confirmation both serve a purpose when documented properly. What they never noticed was that I had stopped thinking of this as a workplace annoyance. I was thinking of it as a compliance issue. That mental reframe removed emotion. Emotion seeks validation. Compliance seeks alignment with rules. One Friday afternoon, Paul stopped by again. Big weekend ahead, he said lightly. You're on top of it. Yeah. I met his eyes calmly. Can you confirm in writing whether weekend oversight is now part of my formal responsibilities? He blinked. It's just temporary. Layla. Understood. I replied. Then I'll need written confirmation for this weekend's requirement. There was no tension in my voice, no edge, just clarity. He nodded slowly. Sure, I'll send something. And he did. A short email, casual tone, but the words were clear. We'll need you to manage operations coverage this weekend. Need. That word again. I added it to the folder. At home that night, I reviewed everything. Total unpaid weekend hours, substantial. Written confirmations of required coverage are increasing. Contract terms unambiguous. There's a moment in preparation where uncertainty dissolves. Not because you feel powerful, but because the pattern becomes undeniable. They had grown comfortable with a system that saved the company money. They hadn't seen it as exploitation. I genuinely believe that. It was a habit, efficiency, convenience. But legality doesn't adjust itself to convenience, and neither does fairness. I wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. I didn't want an argument in the conference room. I didn't want to threaten resignation impulsively. I wanted a correction. And correction, in my experience, works best when delivered through structure, not emotion. By the end of that week, my folder was organized. My calculations have been double-checked. My notes are dated and time-stamped. Still no announcement. Still no confrontation. Just quiet readiness. They thought I was simply absorbing pressure like always. They didn't realize I was building weight. And weight, when placed in the right hands, doesn't shout. It settles. Heavily, irrefutably. The reveal wasn't public. It happened in a small, quiet office with neutral carpeting and a government-issued poster about workplace rights framed on the wall. I booked the appointment on a Wednesday morning during my lunch break. Not dramatically, not in anger, just through the official website of ACAS, the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service. Free, confidential, informational. That word mattered, informational. I wasn't filing a formal complaint yet. I wasn't escalating. I simply wanted professional confirmation that what I was seeing, what I had documented, actually meant what I thought it meant. The advisor on the phone spoke calmly. No judgment, no theatrics. I explained the pattern, the recurring weekend oversight. The framing is flexible, but written in the language of need, the absence of overtime approval despite operational requirements. I gave dates, numbers, contract wording. There was a pause while she reviewed what I had emailed in advance. Then she said something that settled the air around me. If coverage is required and directed by management, those hours are considered working time. If they are unpaid and not recorded properly, that's a compliance issue. Not outrage, not shock, just classification. Compliance issue. She walked me through the next steps. Informal resolution first, written grievance if necessary, and if internal resolution failed. Escalation to a labor tribunal, though most companies correct the issue once documentation is presented. Most companies correct it. That phrase echoed in my mind. Correction, not revenge, not punishment. Correction. After the call, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, because clarity removes doubt. For months, a small voice inside me had asked, am I overreacting? Is this just how operations work? Am I being too rigid? Now the situation had a definition outside my emotions, and definitions change posture. That evening, I did something simple but significant. I calculated the full amount owed based on my hourly rate, including projected recurring weekends already assigned in writing. The number was precise. Conservative, no exaggeration. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't life-altering money, but it was meaningful. More than that, it represented acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that my time was not elastic. Acknowledgement that flexibility has a cost. I didn't celebrate. I didn't text anyone. I opened a new document and drafted a calm, structured summary. Total unpaid weekend hours logged. Written confirmations of required coverage. Contract clause reference. Request for retroactive compensation or time in lieu. Request for formal clarification of future expectations. The tone was neutral, factual, almost clinical. I read it 3 times, removing anything that sounded emotional. This wasn't about how I felt. It was about what was verifiable. I saved the document. Then I closed my laptop and sat in silence. What they never realized was that, by gradually shifting language from casual to written, from verbal to documented, they had handed me leverage. Leverage isn't aggression. It's imbalance corrected through structure. I knew something else, too. Once I sent that document, there would be no returning to the old dynamic. They might adjust quickly and professionally, or they might resist. But either way, the illusion of endless flexibility would be gone, and that was irreversible. The private reveal wasn't dramatic. It was the moment I understood that I no longer needed to tolerate ambiguity. I had documentation. I had regulatory confirmation. I had numbers. And most importantly, I had patience. The only thing left was a decision. Not whether I was right, but whether I was ready. Because quiet dominance isn't about knowing. It's about timing, and timing requires courage. I didn't send the email immediately. That's the part people misunderstand about standing up for yourself. They imagine a surge of adrenaline, a breaking point, a dramatic, late-night declaration. It wasn't like that. It was a Thursday evening. Rain is tapping lightly against my kitchen window. My drafted document is open on the screen. Subject line, blank. I had options. Option 1, do nothing. Keep the documentation, maintain quiet leverage, perhaps use it later during promotion discussions or salary review. Option 2, address it informally with Paul. A private conversation, calm, direct. Give him a chance to correct it quietly. Option 3, submit a formal written grievance through HR, attaching documentation and requesting retroactive pay. Option 4, initiate early conciliation formally through ACAS and let the labor board step in. Each option carried weight. Doing nothing would preserve harmony but confirm the pattern. An informal conversation might work, but it would rely on goodwill. And goodwill had been the foundation of this imbalance. A formal grievance would create a record. It would escalate the tone. It would shift the perception of me. And involving the labor board would make it institutional. Irreversible? I sat back and asked myself a simple question. What outcome do I actually want? Not revenge. Not embarrassment. Not even an apology. I wanted a correction that didn't depend on personality. I wanted the system to adjust so that the next quiet, reliable woman didn't have to build a folder in her kitchen at night. That realization narrowed the options. An informal conversation could be dismissed. negotiated down, framed as a misunderstanding. But numbers reviewed externally, that's different. External review removes personal dynamics. It becomes math, and math is difficult to argue with. I opened my notebook one more time, flipped through the pages slowly, each date a reminder of a Saturday morning reroute, a Sunday escalation, a holiday weekend quick check. I felt something unexpected. Not anger, grief. Grief for how easily I had given my time away because I didn't want to be difficult. But grief doesn't require drama. It requires closure. I picked up my phone and drafted a message to ACAS requesting to move from informational guidance to early conciliation. Short, formal, attached documentation summary. I didn't tell anyone at work. I didn't hint at it. I simply pressed send. The moment wasn't explosive. It was quiet, but it was irreversible. Early conciliation meant the company would be contacted if informal resolution failed internally. It meant timelines. It meant a structured review. It meant documentation being assessed by people whose job was compliance, not convenience. After I sent it, I closed my laptop and made tea. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I felt aligned because the decision wasn't reactive. It was considered. The next morning at work, nothing had changed. Paul asked about shipment forecasts. A colleague asked if I could glance at a vendor discrepancy. Someone joked about weekend coverage. I responded normally. They didn't know a process had already begun, and that's the nature of quiet decisions. The consequences don't announce themselves. They unfold. The labor board did the math for them. They just didn't know it yet. Once early conciliation began, everything became procedural. There were reference numbers, timelines, structured communication. No drama, no threats, just process. A CAS contacted me first to confirm details. We reviewed the documentation again, dates, written confirmations, contract terms. The advisor asked measured questions. Were you ever explicitly told you could refuse weekend coverage without consequence? No. Was coverage framed as required in writing? Yes. Were hours compensated or logged officially? No. The clarity of yes and no felt grounding. Facts don't waver undertone. Then they explained the next step they would contact the company to notify them of a potential claim and offer conciliation before formal escalation. I went to work the next day like always. Answered email, reviewed shipment report, coordinated with warehouse leads. If anyone sensed something different in me, they didn't say it. But internally, I had shifted again. Not emotionally. Structurally, I stopped volunteering additional commentary during meetings. I answered what was asked, no more, no less. I continued documenting weekend requests because the recurring schedule was still active. When Paul mentioned, "We'll need you," Saturday, I responded evenly, "Please confirm in writing." He did. Each confirmation strengthened the file. A week later, HR sent a meeting request. Subject line discussion, working hours clarification. There was no accusation in the wording, just clarification. I knew what that meant. A CAS had contacted them. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 a.m. HR, Paul, and me. I prepared the same way I had prepared everything else. Printed summary, highlighted contract clause, calculated totals, conservative figures, only no rounding up, no emotional language. The morning of the meeting, I wore my usual charcoal blazer, no armor, no statement piece, just professional. In the conference room, HR began carefully. "We've received notice regarding a concern about weekend working hours." Notice, concern, measured language. Paul looked confused, not angry, not defensive, just caught off guard. I spoke calmly. "For the past 6 months, I've been required to oversee weekend operations. These hours were not logged or compensated. I've documented the instances and referenced the relevant contract terms." I slid the printed summary across the table. No raised voice, no accusation, just data. There's something powerful about presenting facts without heat. It removes the option for the other party to escalate emotionally. HR flipped through the pages slowly. Paul leaned back in his chair. "I thought it was voluntary," he said. "It was framed that way verbally." I replied, "But written communication consistently used required language." Silence settled. Not hostile, heavy, because documentation speaks differently from memory. HR requested time to review payroll records and communications. I nodded. Of course. The meeting ended without confrontation. Back at my desk, colleagues asked nothing. The day continued normally. But under the surface, Systems were moving. Finance reviewing hours, HR reviewing compliance, management reviewing precedent. Still, I didn't celebrate, because quiet dominance isn't about winning a moment. It's about allowing structure to correct imbalance. That week, weekend requests paused. No announcement, no explanation. Just absence. And absence can be louder than confrontation. The labor board did the math for them. Now the company was starting to do it too. The first consequence wasn't financial. It was operational. That Friday afternoon, the weekend coverage schedule was sent out. For the first time in months, my name wasn't automatically placed across both Saturday and Sunday. Instead, there was a rotation. Jake, Saturday morning. Priya, Sunday escalation. Layla, on-call support if required. Logged. Loged. That word hadn't appeared before. No announcement accompanied the change. No apology. No explanation. Just an adjustment. An adjustment reveals acknowledgement. I kept my expression neutral when I saw the email. I replied simply noted, "Please confirm the logging process." HR responded within the hour with instructions for submitting weekend hours through the official overtime system. Official? That word felt heavier than any thank you message I had received before. Around the office, something subtle shifted. Jake stopped by my desk late Friday. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "Didn't realize you were covering basically every weekend." I looked at him calmly. It wasn't formalized. He scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, that's not great." No resentment in his tone, just recognition. Priya later mentioned quietly in the break room, "I think HR is reviewing working time policies across the department." Across the department, it wasn't just about me anymore. That's how structural correction works. Once examined, it rarely stays isolated. On Saturday, I didn't open my laptop at 7 a.m. I made coffee slowly, sat by the window, let the morning stretch. My phone buzzed once around 10:30. A group message logged escalation, resolved. I didn't need to respond, because someone else was officially assigned. And officially compensated, that was the quiet consequence no one had anticipated. When labor becomes visible, it must be valued. The following Tuesday, HR requested a follow-up meeting. They had completed the internal review. "We've identified unpaid weekend hours that should have been processed as overtime," HR said carefully. "Finance is calculating retroactive compensation." Retroactive. Paul remained quiet. Not defensive, not angry. Just processing. "The misclassification appears to stem from informal scheduling practices," HR continued. "We'll be updating procedures to ensure clarity moving forward." Procedures. Clarity, I nodded. "That's all I wanted," I said, and I meant it. There was no satisfaction in Paul's discomfort, no desire to press harder. The numbers had already spoken. The labor board did the math for them. And now, finance was verifying it internally. Within a week, a detailed breakdown was emailed to me. Each weekend hour is listed, calculated at the correct overtime rate. The total matched my conservative estimate almost exactly. Seeing it formatted in payroll language felt surreal. What had once been team spirit now had a line item. Around the office, weekend conversations changed tone. No one casually said, "Layla will handle it." Instead, coverage was discussed openly, assigned formally, logged properly. People began hesitating before assuming availability. Not out of fear, out of awareness. That was the true consequence. Not punishment, awareness. Once the invisible becomes quantified, it can't return to ambiguity. And in that quiet recalibration, something else happened. I was no longer the buffer. I was simply an employee with defined hours. Balanced. Respected. Documented. The system had adjusted. But not everyone was comfortable with it. Not yet. Discomfort doesn't always show up as anger. Sometimes it shows up as overcorrection. The week after finance confirmed retroactive payment, Paul asked if we could speak privately. His office door closed softly behind me. He didn't look furious. He looked unsettled. "I wish you'd come to me first," he said. The sentence was calm, controlled. I met his eyes evenly. I did ask about logging hours several times. A pause. "Yes, but escalating externally makes it look serious." It was serious. I replied, not sharply, just clearly. Silence lingered between us. I could see the calculation happening in his mind, not of numbers, but of reputation, budget reviews, leadership perception, the inconvenience of HR involvement. "This could have been handled informally," he said. "Maybe." But informal handling had created the problem. I needed clarity beyond goodwill. I answered, There was no accusation in my tone, no triumph, just truth. He leaned back in his chair. Well, HR's updating policies now. It's become bigger than I expected. Too late to keep it small. That's the thing about patterns. They feel minor while they're benefiting you. They feel significant once they're audited. The company couldn't quietly undo the process. Payroll records had been adjusted. Policies were under review. A CAS had documented conciliation. Even if they wanted to revert to flexible understanding, the paper trail existed now. Irreversible. Outside his office, the team dynamic had shifted further. Weekend scheduling was posted 2 weeks in advance. Compensation rates are clearly stated. Volunteers are requested before assignments are made. Jake joked once. Guess we're all taking turns being backbone now. I smiled lightly. Backbones should be paid. There was some awkwardness at first. A subtle recalibration in how colleagues approached me. Not hostility. Caution, as if they were relearning my boundaries. I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't withdraw warmth. I still helped, still clarified, still coordinated. The difference was structural, not personal. But Paul struggled more than the others. In meetings, he became precise with language. Optional coverage, approved overtime, logged hours. Each phrase is deliberate. Each phrase provides evidence that the system had corrected. One afternoon, I overheard him telling another manager, "We can't rely on assumptions anymore." That sentence stayed with me. Assumptions had been the entire foundation. Assumptions about flexibility, assumptions about silence, assumptions about what I would tolerate. Now those assumptions had cost time, money, and administrative review. Not catastrophic losses, but enough to matter. And once something costs the company money, it stops being personality. It becomes policy. Too late to fix quietly. Too late to pretend it was a misunderstanding. The labor board did the math for them. And numbers, once processed through payroll, don't disappear. In the weeks that followed, no one asked me to just monitor anything without written clarification. No one joked about my weekends being gone. The atmosphere wasn't hostile. It was careful, and careful is a form of respect. Because when people become careful with your time, they finally recognized its value. But there was one more conversation that needed to happen. Not heated, not explosive, just honest. And finally, the final conversation happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. No HR this time, just Paul and me. He asked if I had a few minutes. His tone wasn't defensive anymore. It wasn't strained. It was measured. I stepped into his office and closed the door gently behind me. He folded his hands on the desk. "I've been thinking," he began, "about how this unfolded." I waited. Not stiff, not guarded, just present. I genuinely didn't see it as exploitation. He said, "You never complained." There it was. The assumption. I nodded slowly. I didn't. Why, he asked. The question wasn't accusatory. It was curious. I considered my answer carefully. Because I thought reliability would be recognized without me having to push for it, I said. And because I didn't want to be seen as difficult. He exhaled quietly. That wasn't my intention. I know, I replied, and I meant it. Intent and impact aren't always aligned. Most workplace imbalance isn't born from malice. It grows from convenience. I should have formalized coverage earlier, he admitted. I relied on you too heavily. The sentence hung in the air. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just true. I didn't rush to reassure him. I didn't soften it unnecessarily. I allowed it, I said calmly. That part is mine. His eyebrows lifted slightly. You're not angry. The question almost surprised me. No, I answered honestly. I wanted correction, not conflict. Silence settled between us again, but this time it felt clean, resolved. I hope this doesn't change how you see your future here, he added carefully. There it was, the subtle concern beneath everything. Retention, stability, reputation. It changes how I see my boundaries, I said, not my competence. A faint smile touched his face. That's fair. We spoke briefly about updated procedures, rotations, transparent logging, clear overtime approvals, structural changes that would outlast both of us. There were no raised voices, no apology tour, no dramatic reconciliation, just acknowledgement. When I stood to leave, he said one last thing. For what it's worth, you handled this professionally. I paused at the door. I handled it structurally. I replied, because professionalism can still hide an imbalance. Structure prevents it. Back at my desk, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. There was no need to replay the conversation in my mind. No lingering adrenaline. The imbalance had been named, addressed, adjusted. And what mattered most, I hadn't compromised my tone. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't threatened. I hadn't humiliated. I had remained exactly who I was, just clearer. And clarity, delivered calmly, carries more authority than volume ever could. There was only one final piece left, who I was now, because something had shifted not in how they saw me, but in how I saw myself. I still arrive at 8:27 a.m. I still drink tea before opening my inbox. I still speak calmly in meetings. From the outside, very little has changed, but internally, everything has. Before all of this, I believe being low maintenance was a strength on its own. That absorbing pressure quietly proved maturity. That not needing recognition somehow made me more valuable. Now I understand something more precisely. Value isn't proven by endurance. It's defined by boundaries. I am still reliable. But reliability is now paired with clarity. When weekend coverage is discussed, I ask, is this voluntary or assigned? When additional hours are requested, I ask, how will this be logged when responsibilities expand? I ask, can we formalize that? Not defensively, not aggressively, just directly. And something interesting happened. No one calls me difficult. They call me thorough. The same composure that once allowed imbalance now reinforces structure. Because the difference isn't in my tone. It's in my awareness. I don't over-explain my availability anymore. I don't apologize for having plans. I don't soften no into something vague and negotiable. If I'm unavailable, I say so. If I'm available, I confirm terms. Calmly. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet dominance. It isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling your participation. I no longer feel a flicker of guilt when I close my laptop on a Saturday morning. I don't hover over notifications unless I'm officially scheduled. I don't equate being constantly accessible with being indispensable, because indispensability without structure is vulnerability. What changed most wasn't how my colleagues treat me. It was how I interpret myself. I used to think peace meant avoiding friction. Now I know peace means alignment. Alignment between what I give and what I receive. Between what I agree to and what is recorded. Between expectation and compensation. There's no bitterness in me. I don't replay the past with resentment. In many ways, I'm grateful it unfolded the way it did. If no one had pushed the boundary, I might never have examined it. If no one had normalized my silence, I might never have questioned it. Growth rarely arrives through dramatic betrayal. Sometimes it arrives through mild, repeated inconvenience that slowly asks you, are you paying attention? Now I am. I still carry my black leather notebook, but it no longer feels like a shield. It feels like a tool. Documentation isn't paranoia. It's clarity. And clarity is freedom. The labor board did the math for them, but I did the reflection for myself, and that reflection changed more than any payroll adjustment ever could. There's only one final thing left to say. Not about policy, not about management, but about you. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a triumphant ending. A dramatic promotion, a public apology, a resignation speech delivered with perfect composure. That's not what this is. I still work there. The systems are clearer now. Weekend coverage is logged properly. Overtime is approved in writing. Rotations are fair. There was no explosion, just a correction. And sometimes, correction is more powerful than revenge. What this story really taught me is something quieter. People don't always test your boundaries maliciously. Sometimes they test them because they're undefined, because you haven't drawn them clearly enough even to yourself. For months, I believed I was being strong by staying calm and adaptable, but calm without clarity can become self-erasure. Adaptability without structure can become exploitation. The turning point wasn't when I contacted ACAS. It wasn't when HR scheduled the meeting. It wasn't even when finance processed the retroactive payment. The turning point was the moment I stopped asking, am I overreacting, and started asking, is this aligned with what's fair? That shift from emotion to evaluation changed everything. The labor board did the math for them, but the deeper work was internal. I had to decide that my time was measurable, that my silence didn't mean consent, that professionalism doesn't require self-sacrifice. And here's the part I want to leave you with. You don't have to shout to be taken seriously. You don't have to humiliate anyone to correct an imbalance. You don't have to burn the building down to rebuild your boundaries. Sometimes, all it takes is documentation, patience, and the courage to let structure speak for you. So I'll ask you something simple. Have you ever mistaken endurance for strength? And if so, what would change if you measured your time the way you measure your value?